Well, this is a call for civilian leaders, elected officials, to talk to their fellow citizens as adults and explain the risks and why the cost of failed deterrence is going to be so much greater than having effective deterrence. Easy for me to say, harder to do, but I mean, we've got about 5,000 years of history on which to draw to understand that if you want to prevent a war, you have to show that you're prepared for it. And every time we're not prepared, it always provokes aggression from someone else. Certainly, almost everything he did in Europe, starting with Georgia, happened after the United States withdrew all of its armored forces and began to draw down. But also, by the way, when the British Army withdrew from most of its forces from the continent, the German Bundeswehr drew down, the Dutch drew down, everybody was drawing down. Well, surprise, surprise. So yeah, these are hard decisions, but this is where our leaders have to speak to us as if we are adults.
Over the past week, Russia sent 1,220 glide bombs, 40 missiles, and more than 850 drones into Ukraine, including a couple of high explosive drones that hit the Chernobyl power plant, quite deliberately, it seems. The idea that Putin wants peace is a dangerous delusion, yet at the Munich Security Conference last week, several things came into sharp focus. The Trump administration seems desperate to secure peace and is prepared to grant any concession to get Putin to simply agree to be part of negotiations. The victim of the war, Ukraine, and its largest supporter in monetary terms, Europe, have been cut out of the negotiation process. Ukraine is denied the security of NATO membership. Sanctions against Russia may be eased, and war criminal Putin normalized on the world stage. Moreover, the US under Trump is prepared to extort and blackmail the victims of war and terror, such as Ukraine, to strip its mineral resources, deny its agency, and negate its sovereign borders. Europe is being told it's on its own, with the implication that it comes under Russia's Eurasian imperial sphere of influence. In this episode, we ask, how much worse can the situation get? And what does Putin want us to feel at this point of inflection? Ben Hodges is a retired United States Army officer who became commander of the United States Army Europe in November 2014 and held that position for 3 years until retiring from the Army in January 2028. I'm delighted once again to be joined. We've been discussing what's been going on for more than 2 years now and pointing out that evil that is unchecked will only get worse, and the price of dealing with it is exponential. Well, this finally seems to be becoming clearer to many, including many Europeans. Before we jump into this, thank you to everybody who supported the channel on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. It is incredibly important at this time. Now, this is the only thing I do, creating these videos, creating this content. So it's important to be able to keep doing that. And I am immensely grateful to everybody for their help and assistance. Thank you, everyone, also who helped bring about the events in Lviv and Kyiv. We now have a ambitious program which is being accelerated given what's going on in the world. We hope to run at least one, if not two events every single month throughout Europe and hopefully in Washington as well throughout this year. And again, your support to make that happen is gratefully received. Ben, I'm delighted to welcome you back, albeit the circumstances are tense, to put it mildly.
Oh, Jonathan, thank you. That was a gloomy intro even for you. It's but I think it also is sharp and largely accurate. This is not a game. This is very serious, and I think that we, the United States, Europe, we're all at a very critical juncture.
And this, of course, is not a point that you or I wanted to be at, but it is a point that we were warning. I mean, perhaps not something quite as dire as this, but we have been warning for more than 2 years that things will get increasingly difficult to resolve if firm action isn't taken. And a quick personal question or professional question, what in your training has really prepared you for this moment? We have what appears to be an administrative coup in the US and a high degree of chaos. We have Europe ostensibly abandoned by its ally, or at least there's the implied threat of that, and we have a resurgent Russian empire. Which parts of your training do you call upon to deal with this, especially strategically?
Well, three things come to mind immediately. Number one, the importance of having allies and partners. That no country, not the United States, nobody can achieve its strategic objectives or protect its strategic interests alone. And that is an underlying part of this entire situation we're in now, the need to work with other countries. The second thing, of course, is a reminder that war is a test of will and a test of logistics at every level, at the tactical level, operational level, and strategic level. And then finally, the responsibility of our civilian leaders to clearly identify the strategic objective. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? That if that's not clear, then it's very difficult to develop the necessary policies to achieve whatever it is we're trying to achieve.
And to an extent, there's a certain amount of commonality here, isn't there, between the Biden administration and actually the Trump administration. Everyone's screaming, Trump doesn't seem to have a plan. He's throwing spaghetti against the wall, etc. But Biden didn't have a plan either. And partly this is why we are in this mess. They do not have an idea of how to deal with Putin. And yet Putin has a clear strategy, which is push with your bayonet. And as long as you find something soft to poke it into, keep going. And that's kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah. So on the Russian side, they clearly have no interest in actually negotiating with Ukraine. They don't want to do anything that gives Ukraine a sort of legitimacy or credibility as a sovereign state. And despite the things that President Trump has said about Putin, that he really is concerned about all the dying, nobody really believes that Putin is concerned about anybody dying except maybe himself, and that they have not stepped away from their stated objective of the destruction of Ukraine as a state and the idea of Ukraine as a state. So that has not changed. On the other side, it was maddening for me that the Biden administration never did clearly identify a strategic outcome and never could say they wanted Ukraine to win. Instead, you could only deduce that the interest of the Biden administration was in preventing Ukraine from losing, preventing Russia from winning, but avoiding escalation to something else. That was it. And so you end up where we are exactly today. I actually think, after having thought about this over the last few days at the Munich Security Conference, that as chaotic and incoherent as it appears, there is more of a framework from the Trump administration. Even if I don't agree with it, it's becoming clear than what we saw from the Biden administration.
And one of the key things that have come out, we're not sure exactly which way that goes. Is the US threatening to cut Europe adrift, leave on its own, let it sink or swim? Is that a strategic move to wake Europe up, or is that a genuinely held belief? We actually don't know the answer to that one, and maybe it's immaterial. The fact is, it seems to me that if Europe doesn't wake up, if Europe doesn't take responsibility for its own defense, then the Trump administration may well be minded to leave it within Russia's sphere, its burgeoning Eurasian sphere of influence. No matter how absurd that phrase might sound, I think Russia genuinely, or the leadership, believes this. Did you get a sense in Munich that finally, people are, maybe they're panicking today, but they're starting to make plans?
So first, I don't accept the notion that the Trump administration plans to say, all right, we're tired of, babysitting you guys and providing all your security. So good luck, you're on your own. Because that would be a massive, catastrophic, self-inflicted wound on the United States. No matter how much European countries may invest in their own defense, the fact is that European prosperity is key to American prosperity. Europe as a bloc is our biggest trading partner. So it's in our own interest that Europe is prosperous, which means it needs to be stable and secure. So I don't envision the administration just saying, all right, we're out of here, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of Americans that live in Europe, gazillions of dollars of business relationships with European countries. And so they're not going to abandon that. I can envision probably a reduction in the amount of money that's available for rotational U.S. forces that are here since 2016, actually. So I can see that coming. I don't like it, but I can see that coming. But I think that the administration, like every U.S. administration since Truman, has complained about Europeans not investing enough in their own defense. and carrying a fair share of the burden. But the Trump administration will use tools to inflict pain on countries versus abandoning it. So this every now and then you hear that they're going to pull out of NATO. I don't think so. I think he would rather use tariffs or other tools to put pressure on governments to do more. And of course, no European country should increase its spending because they're worried about getting yelled at by the American president. They should all be doing this because of their responsibility to the security of their own citizens. I can feel that improving a little bit.
And I think the debate will rage as to whether this is a strategic choice or an emotion, but we'll see the impact of that. It seems that immediately Scholz and Macron have started making actual plans, budgetary plans to change the situation, albeit 3 years too late, some would argue. Putin, however, before we hit record, we were debating about whether Putin really wants peace, and in fact whether peace is a completely delusional term, because we knew what happened on Minsk 1 and 2. The idea of peace still meant that each week, dozens of people were killed by artillery rounds, and on a day-by-day basis, Russia would cause provocations. It would lob artillery shells into Ukrainian territory. It would try to provoke Ukraine into action, and then it would lie through its teeth about what it was doing. It seems to me that the talk of peace is illusory because the guns will not fall silent, and we will be in a state of hot hybrid warfare no matter what gets signed.
I see it a little bit differently. You're right that the Russians have not demonstrated any real interest in peace. They have no interest in doing anything with Ukraine as a sovereign state. But I think, unlike the Minsk 1 and 2, which were catastrophic failures, because you did not have anything to compel the Russians to live up to the agreement. Instead, what we're going to see, I believe, what's in the works is a force, not a peacekeeping force. That would be the wrong name for it, but something more of an implementation force, similar perhaps to what we sent into Bosnia in 1995 to implement the Dayton Peace Accord, a real combat force capable of deterring Russia from making from violating whatever the agreements are. So in other words, this is going to be imposed as a result. Now, I don't know for sure how this works out, but I sort of see it in three kind of phases, and this is going to be over many months. This is not something that's going to happen days, weeks, for sure, not even in 100 days, not the full thing. We're in phase one right now, which is sort of the preparation, where everybody's kind of feeling around, seeing what's possible. You've got the U.S. and Russian delegation meeting in Saudi Arabia this week. You've got the French president hosting an emergency summit of European leaders in Paris today. You've got General Kellogg, the American envoy to Ukraine, is there in Brussels today and going to Ukraine tomorrow. So all these kind of things are happening, and nations are starting to think about how would they do this. So that's the preparation phase. Phase two will be a ceasefire of some sort that will require a very strong, capable force, as I've described, that would be European led, but would be enabled by the U.S. most likely. And then the third phase would be the actual negotiations about much more than just a line across Ukraine, but the whole arrangement, and it would include things about Ukraine's future. I'm going to be disappointed no matter what, because it's going to stop short of full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, but at least I think it will include recognition of Ukrainian sovereignty. And it will not include, or we're not going to hear a statement that absolutely Ukraine is coming into NATO, but I think it's some clarity on what was said, that NATO membership is not on the table. In hindsight, that actually is a good thing to say, because you don't want to somehow keep it in negotiations where the Russians have anything to say about whether or not Ukraine comes in. So keep that separate.
And we'll come to that in a second, because it seems, well, let's deal with that now, because from my inexpert point of view, it seemed to me that the Article 5 does not have the power that it had at the Cold War or even a few years ago. So the focus on NATO as the prime security guarantor, that seems to me actually too weak in the face of revanchist empires that we're seeing and their ability to go far beyond what, say, the Soviet Union would consider in terms of provocations during the Cold War. It seems to me that Ukraine needs NATO, or it needs a stepping stone to NATO. For example, I'd love to hear about, the Joint Expeditionary Force or some other such sort of vehicle, smaller, more agile, more focused organizations, and it potentially needs nuclear as well. I think the result of Trump's actions basically imply that having a nuclear deterrent, which could be vetoed by the US, is no longer a cast iron guarantee of security, and you need a huge conventional force armed to the teeth. So, what's your view on Ukrainian security and what it needs in reality, not the sort of fantasies of planners in Brussels and other places that may be still stuck in the mindset of a few years ago or even the Cold War?
Well, certainly it's to our detriment, the detriment of the United States, that Article 5 of the Washington Treaty is even a question. That lessens American influence in Europe. And that does raise the concerns that you correctly have just outlined. Um, but there also is a need for or value in something like the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, or some version of it that can do things that can't be vetoed by, say, Hungary or Slovakia, for example, or any other country that might want to veto something. So countries that are already trained, who have worked together, common standards, et cetera, um, and that have a little bit more political flexibility, if you will, I see value in that. And I could imagine that the force that goes into Ukraine, if and when that decision is finally made, could be something like the JEF plus Poland, for example, or countries that make up the JEF. Uh, that seems to have merit. Now, um, but we have to be clear before you start talking about a force, the size of force, the type of force, who's in it. The most important thing to be done first is, what is their mission? What is the purpose? What are they supposed to accomplish? Are they a reaction force, or are they going to be in the middle in a zone of separation? I mean, that will dictate the size and capabilities that are required, but they have to have a clear mission. You have to have a clear chain of command, and they have to have very strong rules of engagement that would allow them to use force to immediately, the first time the Russians send over a drone or start probing around violating the agreement, they need to get punched in the nose immediately. And so this force has to have those kinds of rules of engagement.
And that implies some interesting capabilities there. Let's run some numbers across you. So Zelensky has alleged that there are a force of around 150,000 Russian troops in Belarus, massing, supposedly on training maneuvers. We've heard that before, that 90% of Russia's military capability is at the moment in Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine, at least somewhere in the region of 850,000 troops. Ukraine potentially will have a similar number, if not more, under arms and trained. What do you need in terms of not just, the numbers of bodies from a Western force? What would you need in terms of artillery units, air cover, and the whole infrastructure of defense, as well as maritime special forces, as well as, of course, air power? The implications actually are huge, even though people focus on, just the sheer number of peacekeeping bodies. That is a small fraction, I'm assuming, of the infrastructure you need to put in place to guarantee their safety and indeed the security, which one would assume is part of the mission.
Well, more importantly, to ensure their success. And I would encourage you not to use peacekeeping force as the name, and I don't think that's what they'll be called, because there has to be a peace to keep, and there is not yet. This is a force that will go in, I believe, before the actual full up negotiations about the long-term resolution of the conflict take place. So it has to be a force that is capable of deterrence against Russian forces. So it has to be joint, air, land, sea, special forces, cyber capabilities. It has to have long-range precision strike capability. It has to have drone and counter-drone capabilities. We have to assume that they will be attacked from the air. If they don't come in with these things, then in fact they will be tested in the first hour by the Russian side, because the Russians will remember how pathetic we were by sending just observers from the OSCE, brave women and men of the OSCE who were there to be observers, but had no capability at all to compel compliance. This is not going to be 10,000 dudes in blue helmets and flip-flops out there. This needs to be a combat force, the size of which will be determined once we know exactly what their mission is going to be. The U.S. contribution to this, I suspect, probably initially includes the enablers that we can provide that European armies or countries can't provide, at least not in sufficient quantity.
Is this comparable to the occupying forces we had on the territory of Germany following the Second World War?
I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't, I don't know if I would use that. To me, the better model is the I-4 that went into Bosnia in 95 in terms for comparison, where for months you had the supreme headquarters of NATO at Shape in Mons, Belgium. The leadership there was working hand in hand with the negotiators, the diplomats that were trying to hammer out the Dayton, what became known as the Dayton Peace Accord, so that all the tasks and agreements in the Dayton Peace Accord were militarily feasible. This is a very important part of this. And then, of course, this force trained very hard, thoroughly, to do the task of separating Bosniaks from Serbs, from Croatians. And they had rules of engagement completely different from the preceding UNPROFOR, United Nations Protection Force, that was a failure. Even though most of the countries were the same countries, you had a different structure, different mission, different rules of engagement. And I think this is probably a good model for what we'll see going into Ukraine.
So you'd have to have essentially the mission criteria would be to be able to fire upon the Russians if attacked and threatened.
Absolutely. And the Russians need to know that. Look, the two best countries in the world today on the use of electronic warfare are Ukraine and Russia. They have years and years of experience doing it with each other. Nothing that we have of any scale in the US or UK or any other countries that I know of. So this force is going to have to go in prepared to operate in a heavily contested electronic warfare environment, jamming, intercept, as well as targeting capabilities. We have to be prepared for that. You have to train for that. You can't just show up with 10,000 French, 10,000 Brits, 10,000 Germans, and 20,000 others, just come together and expect it all to work. There's a lot of training that's got to be done ahead of time. So I do think we're a few months away from this.
And, I don't want to dig into judging the motivations of the Trump administration. We've all seen the words, we've all seen the ambiguity, the contradictions in what's being said, and we see, to an extent, Europeans starting to freak out. But again, I would perhaps argue that after 3 years of full-scale war, 11 years since Crimea, 17 years since Georgia, this is happening a little late in the day, at sort of 2 minutes to midnight. But it is happening nonetheless. Even if that intent starts to change to take control of European defense and take responsibility for that, it seems to me there is still a huge amount of naivety about Putin's mindset. Within hours of Trump announcing there would be this meeting, negotiations, etc., Russia to hit the Chernobyl nuclear power station, the protective covering. Last night, they apparently flew a drone within 100 meters of the US embassy in Kyiv, buzzing it. Whenever Putin makes a concession himself, or whether he wrings a concession out of others, it seems his instinct is to lash out and try to demonstrate to his own people and an international audience that he's still in the boss, that he's still in charge, retain escalation dominance. Do you feel we're starting to understand that, or are we still woefully naive when it comes to Putin's mindset?
I think there are people in every one of the relevant countries that are clear-eyed about who and what Russia is. That they're not confused about who the bad guy is here, and that I mean, even General Kellogg, you may remember a few weeks ago, General Kellogg, the president's envoy to Ukraine, said publicly Russia cannot be trusted. So that's a great starting point for any negotiations, is to acknowledge that the other side cannot be trusted. And Russia certainly has done zero to indicate anything publicly that they're interested in legitimate sort of discussions, unless it leads directly to them getting everything that they want. So this is where we have to. I'm trying to discern, is for the Trump team, are they are they going to use the tools they have? I mean, Trump has so much more leverage over Putin than he did 4 years ago, economically, militarily. He's got a very strong U.S. economy. He's got a Congress that is overwhelmingly pro-Ukraine, pro-transatlantic. Um, and so he can do a lot. He can open up the gates. He can tell Putin, say, look, I'm going to give the Ukrainians every damn thing they want. General Kellogg said the other day that on a scale of 1 to 10, we were only at a 3 in terms of sanctions that have been employed against Russia. So, and then of course, Trump has the ability, working with the Saudis in particular, to cause oil and gas prices around the world to fluctuate in a way that would cause enormous additional damage to the Russians. So he has a lot of tools, and I think he certainly does not want to be seen as the loser or the weak guy in this situation. So we'll see if he uses the advantages that he has. I certainly hope he does.
Now, I mean, you know from our conversations that I come late to this sort of geopolitics. At least I took a 20-year break from it. But my skill is sales and marketing, and I unfortunately get the sense, and it's an emotion rather than an analytical thing, but I get the sense of slight desperation from Trump. Desperation to have a negotiation, desperation to make it really quick, because we know his attention span is limited, to put it mildly. Whenever you're in a sales situation, the last thing you want to give out is the impression of any kind of desperation, any kind of impression that you are willing to make concessions. In a sales scenario, that's dropping your price. In this case, it's signaling in advance what you're prepared to give to the Russians, not as a negotiation, but as a precursor to negotiations. Does it concern you, some of the things you are hearing? Do you get a whiff of desperation and chaos about the process that we see unfolding?
I don't know if it's desperation. Clearly, the president would like to get this done. Um, I think he has three sort of overarching strategic priorities in his mind in regards to this particular situation. Number one, stop the fighting. Stand fast my own personal political beliefs or whatever, and disagreements I might have with that administration. I take him sincerely at this, that he really does, and he has a record of being against wars, long wars, unnecessary wars, and so I think he genuinely wants to stop that fighting. Um, the second sort of main theme from him is to prevent a resumption of the conflict. So based on things I hear him say and people around him say, um, he will, he's not so desperate to get a deal that he won't care about what happens afterwards. Now, everything I'm telling you, I could be proven wrong in a week. I know that. But this is what it feels like after the last 4 days of saturation bombing at the Munich Security Conference. And then the third theme is burden sharing. Like every American president, he's going to expect allies to do more. And, you know, I'm sick and tired of hearing Europeans talk about, oh, we got to do more, we got to step up, but actually no discernible change in the sense of urgency. Whether we're talking about the British Strategic Defense Review, Germany's hiding behind their no debt break laws, and other nations that have reasons that are excuses for not doing more. The vast majority of ammunition that's produced in Europe goes to customers in the Middle East and Africa. So don't tell me that we don't have ammunition to provide to Ukraine. The Czech Republic just delivered 1.5 million rounds. That's the Czech Republic. So there's a lot more that can be done, and I think President Trump is going to drop the hammer on nations that don't do this.
And of course, the calls to go for 5% of GDP. There are squeals of anguish from the bean counters looking at their, their budgets, saying, "Well, we cannot accommodate these increases to say 3.5, let alone 5." And you can see the arguments there, because whereas that's 5% of GDP, there's a lot higher percentage of the budget itself. This would be a revolutionary change. But of course, Britain didn't fund the First and Second World War out of budget. It funded out of special bond arrangements and massive loans, because it was felt that, well, everything was up, everything was at risk. Therefore, you take those steps. Would you say that if Europe's going to take this seriously, it can no longer be part of a sort of, a budgetary tussle? It has to be something like Scholz actually seems to be moving towards this, which is increasing the ceiling on government borrowing and a large one-off structured investment in defense.
So you and your listeners will have already spotted that I'm not an economist, but let me offer 2 or 3 things here. And of course, Germany has an election 6 days from now, on the 23rd of February. Most people assume that the Christian Democrats will get the most votes and that they will have the responsibility to lead, to form a new coalition. We don't know if it'll be CDU and the SPD, which is Scholz's party, or if it'll be CDU and Greens, or a 3-way coalition, which is the least desirable, but also that's a possibility. So at least with the CDU in the lead, and based on what Mr. Meritz has said in the past, I think we'll see a significant increase in German willingness to literally do more. Now, this 5% number is, I mean, the U.S. is not at 5%. And I don't think we can get there, or I don't think we want to actually get there. But the point is, it doesn't matter what the percentage is. You can't put a big sign on your border and say, "Hey, we're 2%, you can't invade us," or "We're 3%. That's not going to cause a Russian tank regiment to turn around and go back. It's about having real capability. The fact is, the polls are almost at 5% now. They're not confused about the threat, and they're making the choices. In the Cold War, Germany was up around 4.2%. So I mean, they can do it. And where I live here in Germany, beautiful part of Germany, there's been no decrease in the number of people going on ski vacations down to Kitzbühel or Wengen or to Saint-Tropez. I mean, so you're right. You can't increase spending unless you're willing to cut other places or raise taxes or find some means to do what needs to be done. And then in the UK's case, I wonder how many Brits appreciate the amount of budget that goes to maintaining a modern, ready nuclear force. It's a gigantic portion of the defense budget, which means that all the other parts of the UK's great military is underfunded. So these are choices that governments have to make.
And yeah, I mean, I'm going to speak to an economist about whether there's possibilities to defer some of that outlay on the new generation of Trident, for instance, to angle it towards conventional. But that's a conversation hopefully I'll be having in the next couple of days. Now, here's a tricky one. Not that hopefully they weren't softball questions up to now, but this is a tricky one. Again, the tone, and indeed not just the tone, but the actual action of the last couple of days, if we look at a contract that was shoved under Zelensky's nose, whatever is going on and the intent behind negotiations, this was pretty grubby. And to call Trump a deal maker, to call him transactional, I think is to normalize that language, normalize that behavior, which actually is much more akin to a mafia technique and nothing to do with normal trade. It seems that at this critical juncture in history, where Zelensky and his nation are under threat of an annihilation, Trump has tried to extort them, blackmail them out of 50% of the rights to their mineral reserves. That is one of the things that is causing Europeans to freak out. My concern here is that given Trump's previous behaviors, when a similar extortion racket was tried to dig dirt on Biden, now we're getting very political here, I'm afraid, Trump may be minded to give Russia a slap. He may also be minded to punish Zelensky and punish Ukraine for not signing this minerals contract.
That could be, and it is very. I mean, I'm not going to try and defend it at all.
No, I don't expect that. Yeah,
but I think that on the other hand, when you think about even Trump, he has to be able to sell this to his own voters, to keep the Congress on side. And so if he can say, look, we've helped bring about an end to the fighting, and we're not even paying for it. The Ukrainians are paying for it. I mean, you remember how he talked about, and of course it never worked out, how he was going to get the Mexicans to pay for building the wall. That never happened. But this to me, and I'm only saying this to try and understand it, not defend it. That this seems how he might try to convey to the U.S., to his own voters and taxpayers, this is not going to cost us. We're going to make money off of this. That feels yucky to me to even have to say that, but this is not a normal time, and I think if Europeans feel uneasy about it, okay, well then roll your sleeves up and get in there and do something instead of sitting on the side and moralizing about how terrible Trump is or how bad the Russians are, but yet you're not actually doing anything. The combined economies of Europe dwarfs the economy of Russia. So you can whinge about, oh, the U.S. is terrible. Do something about it, because at the end of the day, if Ukraine fails, you're going to have millions, millions with the M, more Ukrainian refugees pouring into Germany, pouring into Poland, pouring across Europe, continued disruption of food and energy supplies, which means higher prices for all across Europe, and the very real threat that Russia will do exactly what they said would do, which is to continue the conflict against a NATO country within the next 3-4 years.
On the slightly more positive angle, could this same slightly mafia-like negotiating tactic, could that be used to force the Europeans to finally hand over the 300 billion in Russian central bank assets? Because again, the optics of this are good. Look, we've made Russia pay for its own defeat. I mean, that could be spun as an extremely positive move. It could certainly help Ukraine massively at this point. It would then be used to buy US armaments, which is a double win for the US. And Trump could say, look, we don't have boots on the ground and we're not paying for this victory.
Yeah, that's exactly what they have in mind. And that's also, by the way, a widely supported approach by most European leaders, that this is not normal times, this is emergency. And while there are some voices that have understandable reluctance about what are the knock-on effects regarding the Middle East, etc., if they might pull their money out of European banks because they're worried about it happening to them. The fact is, 300 billion, that is a lot of money to help pay for not only Ukrainian long-term security, but also reconstruction. That seems to me a pretty doggone good investment. And obviously that would be very, very painful for the Russians. But the Russians, until they're defeated, until they actually feel real consequences, they're never going to change. After Putin is going to be another Putin. So to me, this is a gigantic no-brainer.
And I've only got two left because we're running sort of out of time here. Again, one of my concerns here, and if we look at escalation management, I think we both discussed more than 2 years ago how it was likely to fail and why fine-tuning the machine is giving the illusion of control, and yet it's going to lead to worse things. That is exactly what's happened. If you're charitable, you could say that escalation management was about managing risk and preventing nuclear war, which of course it was. But if you're more cynical, You could say that there's an intent behind escalation management to allow both sides to attrit each other to come to the negotiation table. Again, harking back on my fear earlier, this could become one of Trump's policies, which is, yes, we slap the Russians, maybe we don't, but we can attrit the Ukrainians and force them to capitulate. My worry is that this is an option we should also be preparing for, not just what everyone is saying is the worst case scenario. No, I think the current scenario we're seeing is the default. The worst case scenario could be worse than most people are currently willing to imagine.
Well, I've got nothing against the Russians attriting themselves into a total collapse, and we should be prepared, be thinking about the implications of a collapse of Russia. But I'm not so cynical to believe that it's also desirable or that we're willing to let Ukraine attrit itself to such an extent. They're fighting for their life, and I think that European countries should not be sitting in the bleachers, but in fact should be trying to influence the way ahead. And hopefully that's some of what will come out of this meeting today in Paris.
And the last question here, as we wind up, and this is really the sort of theme, I think, of the title of the episode. Europe is finally getting its literal marching orders to rearm and to invest in its own defense, but also not do that as a kind of bean counter, tick the box exercise, genuinely build defense and deterrence capability, and now perhaps with a view to being able to put some of that force onto the territory of Ukraine, as Ukraine being the front line of that defense and deterrence. Is this really a call to prepare for war if we want peace in Europe?
Well, this is a call for civilian leaders, elected officials, to talk to their fellow citizens as adults and explain the risks and why the cost of failed deterrence is going to be so much greater than having effective deterrence. Easy for me to say, harder to do, but I mean, we've got about 5,000 years of history on which to draw to understand that if you want to prevent a war, you have to show that you're prepared for it. And every time we're not prepared, it always provokes aggression from someone else.
And I think a key example there from recent times, of course, was withdrawal of the ships around the Falkland Islands. So we had a number of sort of patrol boats or small destroyers, etc. They were withdrawn as a cost-cutting exercise by Margaret Thatcher. And essentially that then not just provoked Argentina, but it convinced them we were no longer serious about defense. My concern is that whether there's any truth behind it or not, all these noises about potentially withdrawing US troops from Europe, that may not be the intent, but Putin may well read this as the signal that Europe is no longer defended and even at this point defensible.
Well, certainly almost everything he did in Europe, starting with Georgia, happened after the United States withdrew all of its armored forces and began to draw down. But also, by the way, when the British Army withdrew from most of its forces from the continent, the German Bundeswehr drew down, the Dutch drew down, everybody was drawing down. Well, surprise, surprise. So yeah, these are hard decisions, but this is where our leaders have to speak to us as if we are adults.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us again. Sanity in what seem to be extremely dangerous and disturbing times.
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate the opportunity always.